Erasmus was in Bologna and saw Pope Julius make his triumphal entry. To Erasmus, this was a shocking spectacle. To see the highest priest in the Christian Church so glory in the bloody business of war was something he could never forget. But he was delighted to be in Bologna at last, having had to wait in Florence for weeks until the siege was over. He was now expecting to spend a year of study at the university. His long-cherished desire to visit Italy had finally been realized. In England, the Italian physician of King Henry VII had engaged him to travel with his 2 young sons who were going home to Bologna, and to act as their tutor for a year. The year at Bologna's famous university was well spent, but tutoring 2 rather dull boys became boring. Erasmus was delighted when the year was over and he was leaving for Venice. Even more so when he was actually there, seated in a gondola and being taken silently along the winding canals to the house of that printer whose sign was the anchor and the dolphin. Aldus Manutius, the famous Venetian printer, had agreed to publish a new enlarged edition of his Adagia. Erasmus had written to him from Bologna, expressing an admiration for the magnificent type which Manutius had designed, especially the very small slanted letters based on Italian handwriting, and for this reason called italics. On his arrival at the printing plant, the stranger was told to wait. The master was correcting proof and could not be bothered. When Aldous found out who had been kept waiting by mistake, he was most apologetic and more than cordial. He took Erasmus to the home of his father-in-law, where the author was soon to have room and board. The Adagia was not yet complete, Erasmus said, and with great temerity on my part, we began to work at the same time, I to write, Aldous to print. To the printer's surprise, Erasmus sat and wrote in the noisy press room, so busy trying to keep far enough ahead that he said he had no time even to scratch his ears. At the end of 8 months, the author left Venice, pleased with his new enlarged book of adages, but equally glad to be free of the stale bread and bad wine of the boarding-house, as well of his very objectionable roommate, a cleric by the name of Alexander, of whom he unfortunately had not seen the last. From Venice, Erasmus went to Ferrara, where he met a friend of Copernicus, and to Rome, where he was entertained as a celebrity by the gracious Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici. He might have stayed longer in Italy had he not heard from England that on April 22nd, 1509, King Henry VII had died. A letter written in May by Lord Mountjoy was full of enthusiasm for the young King Henry VIII. "Oh, my Erasmus," he wrote, "if you could see how the world here is rejoicing in so great a prince. Avarice is expelled from the land. Our king does not desire gold nor gems, but virtue, glory, immortality. The other day he said to me, 'I wish I were more learned than I am.' 'That is not what we expect of your grace,' I replied, 'but that you should foster learned men.' 'Yea, surely,' said he, 'for without them we should scarcely exist at all.' What more splendid saying could fall from the lips of a prince? The Archbishop of Canterbury is not only engrossed in your Adagia and praises you to the skies, but he also promises you a benefice upon your return, and sends you £5 for travelling expenses." In July 1509, Erasmus was on horseback crossing the Alps, leaving Italy for England. As he rode along, he kept thinking of all that he had seen, read, and observed, and of all the foolishness there was in the world. And yet, How could the world exist without a certain amount of folly? How could people keep on day after day except by fooling themselves that they were happy, or that what they were doing was worthwhile? Moria, that was the Latin word for folly. It reminded him of More, the name of the least foolish man he knew, Thomas More. At the thought of seeing that wise and witty friend again, ideas began to sparkle and play on the subject of Moria in a most amusing way. On his arrival in London, Erasmus went directly to Thomas More's home in the suburbs, and in a few days he wrote a most perfect and delightful satire, which he called Aconium Moria in Latin, or In Praise of Folly, an oration of feigned matter spoken by Folly in her own person. This was a clever device by which Erasmus could say things he would not otherwise have dared to utter without fear of being burned at the stake. Folly, like a jester at a king's court, could speak freely without blame, as if she spoke purely to be amusing. Dame Folly begins her oration quite properly in praise of herself. She alone, she says, with her 2 handmaidens, Self-Love and Flattery, keep the world going. Then she describes various kinds of people, showing how each one deceives himself. There is the merchant who relies upon money for happiness, the soldier who thinks bravery in war will bring him fame, the nobles who take false pride in their birth and nothing else matters, lovers who think all beauty and loveliness lie in the object of their affections, and so forth. After this airy beginning, this light-hearted listing of follies that are relatively harmless, Folly, speaking for Erasmus, strikes out boldly against the true evils of the day, especially the abuses of religion, the sins perpetrated by even the highest dignitaries of the church. Folly was now saying what thousands of people were thinking but never put into words, the obvious fact that there should be a thorough reform within the church which had become so corrupt. This was a dangerous and powerful book, for the very reason that it was amusing and easy to read, and so became very popular and widely read all over Europe. The young German artist Hans Holbein borrowed a copy of the book and covered the broad margins with sketches. Folly, in a jester's cap and gown, is shown lecturing to a class of typical German schoolboys, one wearing donkey's ears. Martin Luther, who had learned his Latin in just such a school, would soon be reading in praise of folly. A very different man from the intellectual, idealistic Erasmus, who speared the evils of his day with the rapier of satire. Martin Luther, passionate and strong-willed, was to strike at those evils with a hammer.